Augusto Caesar Calderon Sandino enjoyed a fine meal with longtime friend and president of Nicaragua, Juan B. Sacasa. They had reaffirmed the peace that had been agreed upon a year ago, enjoying the night among Sacasa's administration and Sandino's inner circle of rebel leaders. As Sandino left the presidential palace, he could see all of Managua under the moonlight, reveling in his success. There was not a U.S. Marine to be seen. He entered his car alongside his father, brother, and other key figures of the guerrilla movement against the American occupation. As they moved towards the main gate, Sandino's vehicle was stopped by Guardia Nacional soldiers violently brandishing their rifles. Sandino, alongside his brother and the two generals, were dragged from their vehicle into the soldiers' truck at gunpoint. They drove for roughly half an hour through the quiet shacks occupied by the peasants that Sandino had defended for over 6 years. They reached the airport just outside the city and kept going to the nearby La Reñaga crossroads. The four rebels were ripped away from their truck and thrown onto the ground. The screams of torture echoed throughout the night as the soldiers attempted to pry any valuable information from Sandino and his comrades. The cracks of machine gun fire silenced the screaming as four corpses slumped to the ground, filling the air with the smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. The Guardia Nacional, under the supervision of General Anastasio Somoza Garcia, had successfully assassinated the leaders of the EDSN guerrilla movement. Somoza continued his crusade against the liberal ideas Sandino planted within the Nicaraguan people. The next day, he launched a massive campaign against the rebel forces, decimating them within a month. With the rebel forces gone and his connections in the United States giving their support, Somoza saw the pathway to the presidency, or rather, the dictatorship. Sandino was a man heavily influenced by his upbringing. Born a bastard to a wealthy landowner, he lived with his indigenous mother, struggling in the abject poverty the workers were subject to on the coffee plantation. Sandino realized early, the great tragedy of my life, misery and powerlessness at my tender age. His father thankfully had a change of heart after running into a destitute 11-year-old Sandino on the street. "Sir, if I am your son, why don't you treat me the way you treat Socrates?" He received an education, climbing to the top of his class, and began working as a traveling mechanic in neighboring countries.
It was during Sandino's adolescence that the United States really began enforcing their will over Nicaragua. The Marines had numerous incursions into Nicaragua before 1912, starting as early as 1853, but they never remained long, with the official reasoning for all of them being to, quote, defend American interests in the region. While the government acted like they were defending the lives of American citizens, the real purpose was the protection of American capital abroad. Some of the American interests included an American navigation company that held a monopoly on all transportations on the rivers running through the Bluefields area. Along the Escondido in Las Perlas, the Bluefields Company, a subsidiary of Cuyamel Fruit Company, grew bananas on vast swaths of government land. Even with a deal equivalent to robbery, the Nicaraguan government never received the money from Cuyamel. Further north along the East Coast, the George D. Emery Lumber Company received 8,000 square miles of national land from the Zelaya government in 1905 with a license to harvest the rich mahogany and redwood found there. The George D. Emery Lumber Company is a special example given the American government's direct involvement in supporting the company's court case against the Nicaraguan government. The Nicaraguans accused the company of not following through on its payment for the exclusive timber rights in the northeast region of the nation. The American government strong-armed a verdict that basically gave away the land to the corporation. The most profitable gold mines, the Bonanza, La Luz y Los Angeles, and Principolca mines, extracted over $30,000 in bullion a month and were in the hands of the New York-based Fletcher family. These unpopular policies of allowing foreign corporations to gut the nation of its resources caused major strife within the Nicaraguan population. The president of Nicaragua, Adolfo Diaz, was unable to quell the increasing number of revolutionaries calling for his removal and enlisted the help of U.S. Marines to once again, quote, protect American interests in the region. Diaz maintained a close relationship with the United States, working for the La Luz and Los Angeles mines as an administrator before his ascension to the presidency. Marines landed in Nicaragua on August 6, 1912, occupying the Bluefields in the Corinto port. Unlike their past incursions into the region, a detachment of Marines was left in Nicaragua to occupy the nation and, quote, preserve the peace as a legation guard, all the way from 1912 to 1934. During the occupation, the United States government made sure to pressure the various Nicaraguan administrations into major economic concessions with the harvest, transportation, communications, and mining of the nation, all controlled by U.S. corporations. This, alongside the humiliation of being subjected to a bigoted occupying force, angered many young nationalistic Nicaraguans. Most importantly, a young man named Augusto Cesar Sandino, who witnessed his country being subjugated and refused to comply.
Sandino returned to Nicaragua in 1921 with dreams of marrying his sweetheart Mercedes, but an argument and fight between Sandino and a childhood friend ended with Sandino shooting the friend in the leg, wounding but not killing him. Sandino worked for the Huasteca Petroleum Company, which was eventually nationalized in 1938, and learned that Nicaraguans were not especially well liked by other Latin Americans. Quote, "I felt so deeply wounded when they would say to me, 'Sell out of your own country, shameless, a traitor.'" The interactions with other revolutionaries and seeing what's possible for Nicaragua cemented his beliefs. Nicaragua had become ignominious, and that honor had disappeared entirely from the people of that land. The liberals of León and conservatives of Granada, who fought for 70 years tearing the nation apart, were nothing but a pack of dogs, traitors, incapable of guiding patriotic and courageous people. Nicaragua will be freed only by bullets and at the cost of our own blood. Sandino returned to Nicaragua on May 15, 1926, shortly after the outbreak of the Constitutionalist War. The Legion Guard Marines had withdrawn from the nation in August 1925 after believing they had done enough stabilization. The inevitable war broke out only 3 months later.
Less than a year after the expeditionary force left Nicaragua, the Marines returned to the trouble spot, this time in force. The liberal leader Chamorro resigned, and Diaz once again was elected president. Bitter guerrilla resistance and bloody battles followed under General Augusto Sandino. Attacks were sudden, unpredictable, as they grew in size and scope.
The president, Soy Oranzo, and vice president, Juan B. Sacasa, were forced from the country and fled in exile. While feigning support for the conservatives, the United States supported former president Adolfo Diaz, a proven president amicable to U.S. interests in the region. Diaz was seen as a compromise between the ultra-conservative Chamorro, who ascended to power through force, and the liberal Sacasa, who had the support of the Mexican revolutionaries. The Mexican connection was viewed as a threat because of their communist leaning, believing that Mexico had the power to form a revolutionary group of states under their direct control with the power to oppose American interests in the Caribbean. While the original occupation served to form a protectorate for American business interests, the Department of State's policy in Nicaragua after September 1926 was based fundamentally on the assertion of the supremacy of the power of the United States in Central America. The Marines moved quickly to reoccupy Nicaraguan ports on both sides of the nation. While on paper it was to maintain neutrality for trade, the real purpose was to isolate the revolutionaries from their international supporters. Sandino had climbed high within the liberal revolutionary structure, becoming a general and leading a brutal yet successful campaign to capture Jinotega on March 28, 1927. The American people were very isolationist after the First World War, and that made an all-out military campaign in Nicaragua politically unfeasible, so the Coolidge administration sent Henry L. Stinson to Nicaragua in April 1927 to act as a mediator between the Marines and rebel forces.
Finally, in an effort to stop these indecisive outbreaks, President Coolidge sent his personal representative, Henry L. Stimson, to arrange an armistice between the two forces.
Shortly after his arrival, he was traveling by train to Managua when passing through the town of Chinandega. 2 months earlier, liberal forces had captured the city, only to be driven out 3 days later by conservatives reinforced with 2 Marine airplanes. The pilots claimed to have never dropped bombs to hurt people, only for, quote, moral effect. The city was decimated by fires, with photos of charred corpses and amputated limbs spreading throughout revolutionary propaganda. The Marine in charge of the operation was discharged, but the damage had been done. Nicaraguans were now looking to avenge their compatriots. The liberals were in striking distance of Managua, and Stimson knew the bloodshed by Americans defending the city would be political suicide. Stimson was able to negotiate a 48-hour ceasefire to affirm a deal to maintain the Diaz presidency. It was during this ceasefire that Anastasio Somoza Garcia introduced himself to the United States government. Somoza had been educated at Pierce College in Philadelphia, and despite being in support of his uncle Sacasa, quote, was not above using his familiarity with the American way of life to ingratiate himself with the Yankee intruders. Somoza successfully charmed Stimson, who remembered him as a, quote, frank and amiable young politician. After heated discussion between Stimson and the War Minister of the Revolutionaries, General Moncada, the liberals agreed to put down their arms and return for supervised elections in 1928. The letter confirming their government's stance was signed by Moncada and all of his generals, except General Augusto Caesar Calderon Sandino. Stimson had successfully negotiated to have American forces occupy a nation like they had never done before. Instead of occupying an entire nation and being put under direct American military rule, the Marines were meant to supervise elections and help maintain order for the Nicaraguan government, until a new native constabulary trained and led by American officers would be ready to take over these duties. That native constabulary took the form of the Guardia Nacional. Established in 1925, it was under the command of a retired U.S. general who was in control of the arming and training of the paramilitary soldiers. Both were supplied by the U.S. Marines, who directly wanted to train a force to occupy Nicaragua in their stead and ensure a pro-American military element permanently remained in Nicaragua. Sandino fervently believed that Moncada had, quote, sold out the liberal army that he commanded as though it were a herd of animals. Published letters detail the encounter between Sandino and Moncada. Sandino found Moncada laying in a hammock adorned with a gold Marine Corps cross when Moncada informed him of his agreement to support the Diaz presidency and surrender all arms to the Marines. He attempts to sway the idealistic Sandino with promises of power in the governorship of Jinotega. Sandino, more resolute in his principles, rebuffs this and continues to instigate for a real answer for Moncada's surrender. Sandino recalled Moncada saying something along the lines of, quote, "It would be madness to fight against the United States. I, Sandino, couldn't do anything with the 300 men under my command. A lamb in the clutches of a tiger." From then on, I felt a profound disgust for Moncada. I told him that I thought it was my duty to die for liberty, and that this was the meaning of the red and black flag that I had raised: freedom or death. After the meeting, he and the soldiers present cursed the Yankee invaders, then questioned the motive behind Moncada's capitulation. Quote, "We all understood that he carried the presidency of Nicaragua in his pocket."
On July 1st, 1927, Sandino issued his first public declaration, now called the Sandino Manifesto. In it, he rails against the American imperialist invaders, touting that no matter how small his forces may be, his patriotism would overcome them. Quote, "I accept the challenge of the dastardly invader and the nation's traitor. Come, more fanatics, come and kill us in our own land. I await you before my patriotic soldiers, feet firmly set, not worried about how many of you there may be." Unfortunately for Sandino's forces, their first combat interaction with the United States ended in a resounding defeat. The Battle of Ocotal began when Sandino's men were caught entering the town in the early morning. With the element of surprise lost, Sandino's men began assaulting the Marines occupying the city. The severity of the situation escalated as Sandino progressed and the Marines called in air support. American bombs were dropped on Sandino's forces, who, unfamiliar with air raids, panicked and scattered, leaving 56 revolutionaries dead and over 100 wounded. Patriotism is only so powerful against 17-pound airburst munitions, and Sandino was forced to regroup in the Segovia Mountains and rethink his strategy. This was the first and last time Sandino amassed his forces into a large attack. Instead, for the next couple months, Sandino replenished his forces and trained them for a completely different kind of warfare to wage against the Americans.
Guerrilla warfare is a tactic of asymmetrical warfare focused on attrition rather than the capture of military or political targets. Rather than mobilizing in large battalions of heavily armed men, small detachments of incredibly fast and incredibly light soldiers travel through underdeveloped areas like jungles and mountains to avoid detection. Men are trained to live off the land for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike and eliminate as many enemy forces as possible and destroy as much key infrastructure as possible. They only engage enemy forces in surprise attacks when the odds are overwhelmingly in their favor to ensure the most damage is done with the least casualties. There is no large area of central control, rather a decentralized network of small camps and detachments set up in the wilderness to ensure survivability if one were to be taken out. It is a form of combat that, despite dealing with for over a century, the United States has been unable or unwilling to find a way of effectively countering. Most recently, guerrilla tactics successfully kept Americans bogged down in Afghanistan for close to 20 years. Vietnam effectively used the land to employ guerrilla tactics against the Americans, who went as far to bomb Cambodia, a neutral nation, because of a hunch that the Ho Chi Minh Trail extended into their borders. The American occupiers in Nicaragua were very unfamiliar with Sandino's method of warfare, as shown in their battle records against the newly trained Army of Defense of National Sovereignty, or EDSN. On February 27, 1928, Sandino handed the Marines one of their most humiliating defeats of the conflict. The youngest soldier of Sandino's general was able to catch a caravan of Marines off guard, inflicting heavy losses and stealing much of their supplies that they were transporting. The effectiveness of the attack promoted Sandino's title within the American military. Previously, he had only been referred to as a bandit in official documents and the American media, but from then on, the title of guerrilla was also used. Sandino continued his campaigns against the Marines and the Guardia Nacional, ambushing Americans and their sympathizers at any given opportunity. The Americans expanded their air campaign using planes for both air raid missions and reconnaissance, but while useful in specific engagements, was effectively countered by Sandino's guerrilla tactics. The air campaign ended up being an effective propaganda tool for the revolutionaries both in Nicaragua and the United States. Bombing campaigns, especially inaccurate ones, are some of the most effective recruiting techniques for revolutionaries. In the United States, the citizens were disgusted to see their government using such military might to force a nation into business. This is one of the primary goals of guerrilla warfare. By aiming for casualties and surviving, Sandino effectively chipped away at American will to continue the conflict. It's a message that every drop of American blood spilled could have been avoided by withdrawing. The Marines realized that their time was running out and began beefing up their training of the Guardia Nacional, knowing that they were going to replace them after they left. The Marines already effectively controlled the government by supervising the elections and ensuring that General Moncada was elected in 1928. On April 1, 1930, a training base was established in Managua to train Nicaraguan officers in the Guardia Nacional. This training base solidified that those officers working in the capital of Managua were 100% loyal to Marine teachings and beliefs. 1931 was an incredibly active year for the guerrillas, having battles throughout the year. Sandino flexed his muscle to the American corporations by burning United Fruit Company plantations along the Atlantic coast.
You and Jimmy Lloyd were the only survivors of that Moss Farm massacre, weren't you?
Yes, we were the only two that were lucky enough to get away.
Well, can you tell me something about what went on there that night?
Yes, we were all standing on the railroad track there at Moss Farm late in the afternoon, and the bandits walked out of the bananas and started shooting at us.
Who all?
Well, there was Brian and Bond and Pinky Wilson and Davis and Lloyd. And when the bandits started shooting, we all started running and trying to get away.
And where'd you go?
I hid in a ditch under some old trees and brush that had fallen down there.
And how long did you stay there?
I stayed up there until 1 o'clock, and all during the night, you could see those bandits walking up and down the track with flashlights, shooting at any moving object, trying to kill every one of us.
So tell me, do you think there's any chance for the United States government to handle that situation if they ever got to it?
Yes, they could. The bandits could be wiped out. But the attitude that the State Department is taking now only intends to increase the number of bandits because they feel that they can go on and kill these American citizens down there and nothing will ever be done about it.
American morale for the conflict had reached an all-time low, with now Secretary of State Stimson hoping to Nicaraguanize the conflict by leaving the Guardia Nacional in hands of Nicaraguans. As Sandino was waging his war with the Marines, Somoza had leveraged his early connections with Stimson to ascend to the governorship of León, then the Nicaragua Council to Costa Rica, and finally the foreign minister of the Moncada administration. This put him in direct contact with Marine generals constantly, and he once again used his American experience at Pierce College to schmooze them. As the Marines began drafting their plans to withdraw, the Marines looked to Somoza as their man on the inside and potential successor to head of the Guardia Nacional. Juan B. Sacasa was the vice president exiled during the Constitutionalist War and served as the leader of the revolutionaries until Moncada's betrayal. Sandino remained close to Sacasa, cautiously optimistic of Sacasa's dream of a liberal Nicaragua. While Sandino was fighting, Sacasa was attempting to garner international support with less than stellar results. After years of brutal fighting, Sacasa believed the Americans had been beaten enough to finally return to Nicaragua. In September 1932, Sacasa announced his campaign for president. The Americans agreed to oversee the election and, seeing a clean out from an incredibly messy affair, announced their withdrawal from the nation.
It was to be done after the 1932 election. Sacasa won the presidency in November, with the Marines certifying the results. Sandino's guerrilla campaign had been a success. On July 1st, 1933, Sacasa took the presidency, and the next day the Marines officially withdrew from Nicaragua, ending over 20 years of occupation, humiliation, and revolution. A total of 136 U.S. Marines lost their lives during the occupation. 32 were killed and another 15 succumbed to their wounds. The total number of Marine casualties was less than what the EDSN suffered at just Ocotal, the first battle of the conflict. When including the Guardia Nacional, the occupation forces suffered a total of only 122 combat deaths, which is very low for over 6 years of brutal guerrilla conflict. The Guardia claims to have personally killed over 1,100 bandits, but that number is likely highly over-exaggerated given that they only lost 75 of their own. These low casualty numbers were something to celebrate in Washington, with Stimson reminiscing over a decade later that the Marines, quote, had remained to disarm the contenders, chase the bandits, and hold an election, and they left behind in the end a country peaceful and independent. It was a job well done. He continued on how if a Latin American politician was, quote, frank and friendly, he could talk turkey, and the American government found their frank and friendly politician in Somoza.
The Americans were aware of the damage a completely liberal or, God forbid, socialist government could have. They planned from the very beginning of the expanded occupation in 1926 to train and supply a contingency force loyal to American interests in the region. As Sacasa was beginning his campaign, Somoza saw the opportunity to weasel his way into the government and obtain the head position at the Guardia Nacional, cementing U.S. control over the paramilitary force of Nicaragua. The Liberal and Conservative Party both agreed that the Guardia Nacional should remain a non-political force in the Nicaraguan government, with its powers maintained as a military police force. Despite the universal consensus, Sandino was adamantly against this. He rightly believed the Guardia Nacional to be a puppet force of the United States and therefore unconstitutional, calling for a complete dismemberment of the force. Unfortunately, his objections were overruled, and the paramilitary was codified as the primary military and police force, with Anastasio Somoza Garcia as the head of the department. After the Marine withdrawal, Sandino continued his campaign against the Guardia Nacional, as they had been adamantly supporting the Marine occupation, and he finally agreed to enter peace talks on Christmas Eve, 1932. This was done with the express stipulation that the Sacasa administration was, quote, not tied up in public or private commitments with the United States. After 2 months of deliberation with Sacasa's government, Sandino traveled to Managua and signed the peace treaty on February 2nd, 1933, officially ending 6 years of civil combat in Nicaragua. 2 weeks later, the EDSN forces surrendered their firearms and Sandino pledged his support to the Sacasa administration. Somoza, now holding complete power of the Guardia Nacional, held a grudge against Sandino that had made the last 6 years hell for his men. Sandino's liberal beliefs were opposite that of Somoza's, which fell in line with other popular new leaders of the time: dictatorship. Sandino was infuriated by Somoza's brazenness and petitioned Sacasa repeatedly to rein in the forces illegally arresting and murdering his former soldiers. After signing the peace treaty, Sandino's forces were regularly harassed by Guardia soldiers, with some interactions escalating to gunfire. Sacasa attempted to mediate the conflict by beginning the process to amend the Constitution to make the Guardia forces more in line with the Liberal administration's goals, but that did little to stop Somoza. In January 1934, Sandino publicly proclaimed the unconstitutionality of the Guardia Nacional, putting a massive target on his back. In a conversation with Nicaraguan poet Sofonias Salvatierra, Sandino recounts, quote, "They are surrounding me. For about a month, the guard has been taking up positions around Wiwili. The guardsmen say they will destroy me. General Somoza wants to destroy me. And what good is General Somoza? He's important because of his rank. Later, nobody will ever look at him again." This statement is sadly very untrue. 2 days after the meeting with Salvatierra, Sandino was interviewed by the prominent Nicaraguan newspaper, La Prensa, on February 17th, in which he clarified his previous statements about the Guardia. Quote, "You will not turn over your weapons until the Guard has become a constituted body?" "Yes, sir. Those are my words." This was a direct call out of Somoza and his puppet force, and this enraged the head of the Guardia. He immediately began drafting plans to assassinate Sandino without the support of President Sacasa. After all, he was in control of the primary military force in the country, allowing them to debauch as they pleased with no regard for their role in society. On February 18th, Sandino met with President Sacasa, who promised to protect the veterans who fought under Sandino. Things were looking positive for the future of Nicaragua, as plans were actively being made to curtail the Guardia's power and establish a firm peace within the area. Unfortunately, Somoza refused to let that happen. He successfully convinced his higher-ranking subordinates to unanimously sign a document pledging their total support to any action taken by Somoza. Somoza ordered the assassination of Sandino on February 21st, 1934. Sandino was attending a dinner at the presidential palace alongside major guerrillas and cabinet members alike. Many promises were made to Sandino, who left the party feeling cautiously optimistic for the future. As they reached the gate of the palace, their car was stopped by a large force of guardias. "Stop the car. Anyone who raises a hand will be shot." Everyone was removed from the vehicle and surrendered their weapons. While detained, Sandino is reported to have asked the captors, quote, "Why are you doing this if we are all brothers? We have made peace and we are seeking the restoration of Nicaragua through labor. I haven't done anything except to fight for the freedom of Nicaragua. Only 3 nights ago, General Somoza embraced me as a sign of harmony. Call General Somoza so he can come here and tell me what he wants." He received no response. One asked if this was an order from the president, as a reminder to who was really in charge. No, it's a military order, and it must be respected at once.
The details of the assassination have already been discussed in the introduction. Sandino, a rebel to his last breath, attempted to give a souvenir to his assassins, but upon searching his pockets, found nothing. Jodido, mis líderes políticos me embrocaron. I'm fucked. My political leaders already stole everything. Somoza had successfully eliminated the head of the revolutionary forces, and with the complete support of the Guardia, began drafting plans to assume the presidency. The American government response to the assassination was lackluster at best, and it is important to note that there is no evidence connecting the U.S. to the killing of Sandino. But there is evidence of a tacit approval of Somoza's actions, with a government document noting, quote, "Relations with General Somoza are of a particularly friendly nature." This was written after Guardia forces began their harassment campaign of EDSN veterans. While there are no direct links, quote, "Once you train someone to shoot, give him a gun and point it, you cannot deny responsibility when he later shoots."
Somoza had successfully eliminated the head of the revolutionary forces, and with the complete support of the Guardia, began drafting plans to assume the presidency. Sacasa was enraged at the assassination of his friend, but was powerless to stop Somoza. Somoza began his campaign against the remaining EDSN forces, and for the next month, decimated them. Sacasa could only watch as he lost more and more power until Somoza had gained enough support to begin his coup d'etat. Somoza and the Guardia Nacional overthrew President Sacasa, and Somoza was inaugurated president on January 1st, 1937. Somoza's way of leading stayed consistent and simple throughout his family's rule. Maintain the support of the Guard, cultivate the American support, and co-opt any popular domestic power contenders. The Somozas held direct control of the Guardia Nacional and encouraged them to be corrupt and exploitative. Gambling, prostitution, smuggling, all were run by the Guardia Nacional, acting as a uniformed mafia rather than a US-trained military force. Somoza Garcia was an expert in dealing with Washington, consistently backing their foreign policy agendas. The U.S. used Nicaragua as a training ground for the CIA for its campaign to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz. In return, Somoza was granted Lend-Lease Act funds in order to modernize the Guardia Nacional while also being lavishly entertained at the White House. Despite his ruthless nature, the U.S. enjoyed the anti-communist sentiment that the Somozas held. FDR is quoted as allegedly saying, "Somoza's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch." While this direct quote has been debunked many times, the sentiments in Washington were very similar. But the story of the Somoza dictatorship is a story for another time. I hope to eventually turn this into a 4-part series on the complete history of American involvement in Nicaragua. This project took an incredibly long time to complete as an amalgamation of years of research. I've attached a list of sources in the description that correlate to those seen in the video. Thank you for watching.